This meeting is being recorded.
Hi, everybody. That's Mary Birdsong. I'm the program chair for a little while anyways. And tonight we have Bernard Brown, who goes by Billy, and he's a nature writer for Grid Magazine, which is an environmental magazine in the Philly area. He's also the author of Exploring Philly Nature, a guide for all 4 seasons. He's the co-host of the Urban Wildlife Podcast and co-founder of the local nature hub, phillynature.org. So obviously he's very busy. He is a reptile and amphibian aficionado who has, against all plans and intentions, picked up birding as well. And if you want to read more, his blog is Where the Brown Snakes Roam. And I think you have that in your presentation so people can get to see that again.
Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, Billy Brown.
Well, thank you. And I want to just add a note of appreciation for Erie. I was saying before the call that in a previous career that ended only a few years ago, I had the opportunity, really the privilege to travel around Pennsylvania. I made it to Erie a few times. Mark, who joined the call, who I know through PA Amphibian and Reptile Survey, which is a sort of state citizen science initiative. And Mark was incredibly hospitable to take me out looking for short-headed garter snakes. And when I say that, it's important to know culturally that, like, while birders like just seem to tell each other about what they find and where they find it, like at the drop of a pin, like people who look for snakes were usually very cagey and suspicious of each other. So that was so I am always really appreciative when someone takes me out to their spots. So this talk, it came out of talking with someone named Lee Altadonna, who is with an Audubon chapter in the Philly area, and he had been in the loop when I was writing the book, and he invited me out to talk about something connected with the book. And I thought, okay, maybe I could do something really easy that's really in my wheelhouse, because when I thought about it, like any bird-related topic that I could talk about in any Audubon chapter, like half the folks there are going to know more about it than I do. And I sort of was scratching my head for a while. And so I thought, okay, why don't I make it a little bit provocative and more of like a polemic or an editorial piece. And so I decided to launch into a little history and defense of a group of birds that I've been referring to, some friends and I have been referring to as the unholy trio, which is a dramatic term. But on the podcast that I have with a good birder friend of mine, Tony Crosdale in Philadelphia, we were talking to a leader of a national birding organization, and he just, the guy we're interviewing just offhandedly referred to them as the unholy trio. Pigeons, sparrows, and starlings, it just refer to them in their shorthand. That get very little love from birders, right? And very little love from anybody, I think. Though when we're looking at the wildlife of a city, these are probably the wild vertebrates that people most often encounter. And maybe there's a tie there with the beloved gray squirrel. But in this presentation, I think I'm not going to try to convince you that they're worthy of conservation effort in the same sense that some of our native species are. I know that the people out there with bluebird boxes are going to have very strong feelings. And if you guys want to sit out there with BB guns and pick off starlings and sparrows, I totally understand. But I do hope that I can convince you that these species are worthy of our study, our attention, and maybe some respect. And more so, I think each species demonstrates a different way that we humans have related to birds over the centuries. So these aren't just animals that flutter around in the background. We have, and for centuries, thousands of years, millennia, have had really real relationships with them. So we're going to meet the first one, the rock pigeon or rock dove. I see it written sometimes. Columba livia, to use the Latin name. And so I'd like to, of the three, I think of pigeons as having maybe the most profound relationship with humans out of the three, well before they ended up being the rats with wings that some people think of them as in cities. Pigeons are basically livestock that went feral. They originated as of course a wild bird species in Eurasia. I think a lot of people might know by now, sort of nesting on cliff faces, eating grain, and we domesticated them with the beginnings of agriculture in the Middle East. And it's easy to see why. I think they basically feed themselves. We can feed them more, but they can pretty much feed themselves from the food that we or our livestock drop, as well as all the grain, all the weeds that grow along with the grain in our fields. And it's just really easy to give them more food because our food is their food. And I imagine well before agriculture, humans were probably raiding pigeon nests. I think raiding bird nests for food is probably something humans have done before we were human, way back. And at some point, many thousands of years ago, maybe 8,000 years ago, really long time ago, someone probably sat there and thought, rather than climb cliffs to catch these birds, why don't we build them a fake cliff? And so build a special little house with niches on the inside where they can nest in. It's a lot easier just to pull up a ladder. And when they're fledging, we'll grab them and eat them. Could you go to the next slide, please? So I thought I'd pull up some of the earliest words that we probably have for domesticated, or for pigeons as domestic birds. In Mesopotamia, where arguably, city living and modern, and agriculture began first. The first language of Mesopotamia was Sumerian. Started to get written down about 5,000 years ago in what you're looking at, which is called cuneiform. And Akkadian was sort of the next language of Mesopotamia. And so we've got something like, and I usually I apologize to speakers of languages when I mangle their words, but no one has spoken these languages as a native language for thousands of years. But something like Amorsag in Akkadian or Tugur in Sumerian were words for pigeons. There are, it's fun to look this kind of thing up. There are clay tablets in cuneiform that have recipes from Babylonia, basically, and they include pigeon recipes. So these are birds that go way back. And if you go to the next slide, this is a dovecote, and that's a term that I had heard my whole life and not really put it together until I don't know, 10, 15 years ago. But a dovecote is a building that you build with pre-made sort of nesting cavities or nesting ledges for pigeons. And then you can let the adults fly free, and you eat them when they're about to fledge. You eat the squab. I'm just curious, how many folks here have eaten squab before? You can use your little hand raising feature in Zoom if you want to throw a hand up to say that yes, you have eaten squab. I'll put my hand up. You can't see it, but I'll say it. But no, not a lot of squab eaters, at least showing themselves so far. But it is a luxury item these days. It is something that you get in a fancy restaurant. I think I ate squab once when I was in high school. I've been a vegetarian for years, but not when I was in high school. And I think my dad kind of dared me into it. We were at a nice restaurant, and he's like, Billy, that's pigeon. And so I had to try it, and it was absolutely delicious. I remember that. But it's a funny thing that a bird that is among urbanites, maybe the most looked down upon bird that we've got, is also one of the most expensive things you can get in a restaurant. You have to name it something else. And so, any case, we imported. Oh, can you go back up, please? we imported them as meat birds, as livestock, with the first European colonization of North America. And like I said, the adults fly free, so some of them are going to set up nests somewhere else. Of course, we've also bred pigeons for their plumage. We bred them for racing. So we've kind of had this constant input of domesticated pigeon into the feral stock in cities in North America and around the world, really. And so that is how we got the pigeons that are strutting all around us today. Next slide, go ahead. The house sparrow actually has in some ways, a parallel story to the pigeon. Its origins go back to roughly the same place, the Middle East, in roughly the same time, about, if I read this right, around 10,000 years ago, 8,000 years ago, is when they see the like when you look at the genetics, when the house sparrow, as we think of it, Passer domesticus, you see it split from the sort of predecessor populations of the same species, and there are still pre-domesticus, is one way to think of it, house sparrows out there. I think the subspecies is Bactrianus or something like that. But basically around 8 or 10,000 years ago, house sparrows started hanging around people as we were living in houses with great cavities for them to nest in, I'm sure. Same with mud brick and thatch, as well as with brick and wood here. And they ate grain, but they sort of evolved sturdier bills, sturdier skulls in general, as well as ability to better digest starches around that time also. So that this is a story with a lot of things we think of as domestic animals like cats and dogs. They kind of domesticated themselves in a sense, and lost their fear of people in a way that I think most birds we encounter still have, right? My favorite example of this is if I'm at a playground in Philadelphia in the winter, especially if it's one with a little bit of, and there's one I have in mind in particular it's like a long railroad tracks on the other side of the fence. And so it's kind of weedy in the back. And you can see, I see white-throated sparrows come in there and sort of peck around the fence line. And they don't let you get too close, right? You get, 10, 15 yards away from a white-throated sparrow and it usually flies away. Whereas the house sparrows are like diving into strollers to pick out the Cheerios, So and as an evolutionary process, it can make sense to us, that there were, if you imagine, there were some sparrows that randomly developed some genetic mutation that had them lose their fear of people. They were able to get closer and glean more of the stuff we dropped. So that's sort of where house sparrows come from in terms of their evolutionary story. And then those sort of the ones that were used to people spread along with agriculture across Europe and across Asia, and sort of have kind of swamped whatever the original house sparrows were for the most part. There still are a few left that don't associate with people. They migrate. They're like wild, strict, like what we think of when we think of wild birds, but they're very much in the minority now. But then you might ask, how the heck did they get to North America? You got to go back to the mid 1800s. And this is a time when, if you know about PA environmental history, it's similar to a lot of North America was mostly deforested. Cities weren't necessarily what we would think of as pleasant places to spend a lot of time environmentally. And people were planting street trees to try to improve things. And street trees were getting hammered by caterpillars. And it's something when you read about tree planting efforts and park development in like the 1800s into the early 1900s, they're always complaining about caterpillars. And so in the 1850s, Portland, Maine, New York City, they had some introductions of house sparrows in an effort to control the caterpillars. Boston came in a little after that. And then in 1869, Philadelphia got in on the act. And there's a book that you can look up on Google Books. One of the great things about these old books that are out of copyright is you can usually find them and read them on Google Books, by the way. But Thomas Gentry in 1878 wrote a book called The House Sparrow at Home and Abroad. He tells the story very well that Philadelphians had been desperate for a solution to an infestation of what they were calling inchworms. And a lawyer from the neighborhood of Germantown in Philadelphia, who was originally from England, basically offered. He was going home. He said, I can come back and bring sparrows back with me. City council said sure, and he returned with more than 1,000 house sparrows and released them in Philadelphia. And this was happening in cities all over the country. House sparrows thrived because basically they had spent thousands of years adapting to live around people, nest in our buildings, to eat our food and peck seeds out of horse manure in city streets and around farms. And that's exactly what they did. And of course, I don't know, if I could be in a room with you guys, I'd ask how many folks think that house sparrows would be the bird you'd pick to control a caterpillar problem. And it wouldn't be my first choice. They do catch a lot of bugs to feed their young when they're raising them, but after that, they're, of course, granivorous, grain eaters. And they pushed out native species that people really liked. And by the way, I will mention that this was something I developed for Philly, but the Philly does connect to the Erie in this case. Another book I found, 1888 book by Walter Bradford called The English Sparrow in America. He basically lists their first occurrences and release history for American cities. In 1871, apparently 102 house sparrows were taken from Philadelphia and released in Erie. So the city of Erie can thank the Philadelphia and our sort of our route of sparrow introduction for the urban Erie population. And then within 10 years, they were reported in large flocks in farms all around Erie County, apparently. And as we all know, house sparrows don't play nice with other small cavity nesters. And bluebirds, house wrens, they sort of earned the hatred of bird fans and set up what some historians refer to as the Sparrow War of the late 1800s. On one side, you had sparrow advocates like Thomas Mayo Brewer. You're going to recognize that last name, I think, from some birds. And on the other side, you had sparrow opponents. One of them, Eliot Kous, and also including Philadelphia's Thomas Gentry, who wrote the book that I mentioned. And they were pointing out that these birds were actually having an ecological impact with other birds. And then they'd go back and forth in the scientific press and in popular press, getting really personal. An article I just read about this, apparently Eliot Kous, 17 years after Brewer's death, was still writing angry op-eds about Brewer because of their difference on the sparrow issue. And if you go to the next slide, I got just a fabulous quote from Eliot Kous writing about sparrow introduction in Washington, D.C. The first part I didn't include is he said, "These rowdy little gaymans squeak and fight all through the city to our great disgust." Gaymans, I had to look that word up. It means like a street urchin. And these sparrows do molest, harass, drive off, and otherwise maltreat and forcibly eject and attempt to destroy various kinds of native birds, which are therefore deprived of certain inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness after their own fashion. And so that's, fierce language about house sparrows. But in the end, the house sparrows won, right? And, like I said, they were pre-evolved to thrive here. And it's exactly what they did. And just a little note, if you want to read a great little, an article about 10 years ago in Smithsonian by Rob Dunn called "The Story of the Most Common Bird in the World." He does a good sort of review of the evolutionary history of house sparrows. And a little note here at the end, though, is that they're actually in decline worldwide. in the United States, we don't really, I think most people don't care that much that they're declining somewhat. Although I might argue that, we should be concerned anytime an animal species or any species is in decline and we don't quite know why. This is particularly concerning to Europeans, people in India, who actually started something called World Sparrow Day in April, and trying to gain more attention to their conservation challenges in Eurasia. So the next one up, the third species, we can go to the next slide. This is the European starling. And this is a little bit slightly more recent transplant, Sturnus vulgaris. They're part of an old world family that includes lots of other species that we call sparrows, that we call starlings or mynas, depending on the species, but they're basically all, you could call them all starlings, or you could call our starlings mynas, I guess. But I guess, if we were in a room, I'd say, hey, raise your hand. But think to yourself, if you know that story about the pharmacist in New York City who wanted to introduce all the species of birds mentioned in Shakespeare's plays. And I'll say that only turned out to be partly true. The pharmacist, whose name was Eugene Shefflin, was a leader of the American Acclimatization Society, based in New York City. And that society released 80 pairs of starlings into Central Park in 1890 and 1891. They reached Philadelphia by 1910. I'll show a map. Actually, go to the next slide. I think that's the next slide. I've got the map. Maybe not yet. Well, we'll hold up. Go one more slide. Thanks for bouncing around for me. There we go. So this is a map showing the expansion of starling range. I'll get to, so you can sort of see what they were doing. So you can see by the mid 1920s, they had reached the Erie area, right? In terms of what this author, May Thatcher Cook, writing in 1928, what she sort of figured was their breeding range versus those dots on the map, which were more occurrences, but maybe weren't so established. There's a great book also from 1928 called Wild Birds Introduced or Transplanted in North America by John C. Phillips. And what he's writing about is that, trying to document all the bird introductions in North America, or into the United States, I guess. And the starling introduction was far from isolated. Other people tried to, there were acclimatization societies or acclimatization groups all over the country. And their thinking was to improve North American fauna by introducing species from other places. And in some cases, this is sort of in the background. We might not think of it much today, but in the hunting world, of course, people introduce bird species like ringneck pheasants from the perspective of the upland game hunter to improve hunting. But people were introducing lots of birds more for aesthetic purposes also, just because they liked them, they thought they were pretty, they did nice songs. And just to give you a sense of the scale, in Cincinnati, the acclimatization there in the 1870s released apparently 3,000 individual birds of 20 different species. So lots of people were introducing things like skylarks and nightingales and song thrushes. Virtually all of these failed. It's the part that I take away from this is that it can be pretty hard to establish an exotic species. Even the European starling, there were several introductions. Apparently, most of them failed. There's some question whether some of the ones outside New York City took, but it's at least as of the 1920s, the thought was, no, the ones in New York were the ones that really took, and the other ones mostly died out. And so if you go back up one slide, thanks. I've got a quote from John C. Phillips. I'm not going to read the whole thing. It's a long quote. But he's talking about how there's two schools of thought. Some people who are really believe in preserving the present or original status of native birds, and he says harmless mammals. I would quibble with that harmless part, mammals, and he points out the great dangers incurred in the importation of new species. The other school would bring in anything from a button quail to an ostrich without any regard to the general suitability of the species. And so he's documenting it. He's definitely not a neutral observer, right? As he puts it at the end, which I think is an important thing to remember, it is impossible to maintain our bird fauna at anything like its original balance, whether new varieties are introduced or not, because of man's operations over the face of nature. It's an interesting way, we think about how exotic species take hold or don't. There's some that really do run wild. A lot of them, as you look at them, you realize that they don't extend much beyond urbanized or heavily farmed areas. That a lot of the things that we introduce do well around sort of our style of civilization, where, as he would put it, where we are operating over the face of nature. So this puts us now at I think if you can advance 2 slides now. I'd say that in any case, we are stuck with these species, right? Whether you like them or not. And again, we got, I'll say, through 3 species introduced for 3 different reasons. 1 culinary or livestock, 1 to try to for what we today might call its ecological services, at least as they were assumed to be at the time, and 1 introduced for aesthetic reasons. And they do offer something to some native species, certainly as food. I'm going to bet that Erie is like Philadelphia in that you've probably got urban populations of Cooper's hawks and sharp-shinned hawks, kestrels, peregrine falcons. Maybe seasonally, but that these are species that live in the city at least part of the year, occur in the city at least part of the year, and mostly eat these 3 species of birds, right? Maybe with some mourning doves sprinkled in there. I see, like this is a picture of some pigeon feathers or pigeon carcass really, that I found a block away from my house. These were popping up for a few weeks under like a line of trees on a block. So somebody was catching pigeons and eating them, in my neighborhood. The red-tailed hawks, I've seen red-tailed hawks eating pigeons, and I've seen them eating starlings. A friend of mine observed red-tailed hawks basically pulling nestling starlings out of out of nest holes. I had kestrels, pigeons to mourning doves. I think they're in the same family basically, but so they're both pigeons or doves, but different genera. Any case, the kestrels on my block mostly ate house sparrows. And I remember because when I first saw them, I was like, what are they going to eat? Because I always thought of kestrels as like classically perched up on a wire, catching mice or grasshoppers or snakes or something out of a field. And then, once you start watching the house sparrows pump out like clutch after clutch of like klutzy little fledglings, you've seen them, like the little feather balls, with, begging for food on the sidewalk, or, in low branches or bushes. You're like, oh, that's kestrel food everywhere. Any case, so we have that kind of ecological function with respect to native species, which might win them some respect among fans of the native birds. If you can go to the next slide, that'd be great. The other, a few weeks ago now, as I think about it, it was in February. I was walking through downtown Philadelphia. It was a really cold day, really windy, and I had stopped from it to watch pigeons. They were trying to catch some sun on a south-facing side of an old high-rise building, and they did what pigeons do, which is, every now and then a bunch of them would fly out for no apparent reason. They'd sort of wheel around and then land again. Some of them were kind of flying down and up from the ground, and they were gorgeous to watch. Pigeons are beautiful flyers. And I just sort of sat there and sort of, it was like my nature for the morning, right? Starlings, starlings have beautiful iridescent feathers. Especially males in their prime are just fabulous to look at when the sun hits them. And when, you think of how a starling sings, like with its like wings, like kind of half sticking out with all of its like, just when it's belting it out. They can be just fabulous to watch. And I think my favorite point here to wrap up with, which is what I focused on them in my book, is that basically any person in an urban neighborhood, practically in most of North America, Erie as much as Philadelphia, all of us have a chance to watch birds every day. We don't need binoculars. We don't need spotting scopes. You basically just step outside, and maybe you're just going to notice things as you're walking around, or maybe you can find that kind of calm that lets you sit there and just observe for a little while. And you can watch them listen. You can watch and listen to them sing. You can watch them forage. You can watch them, try to attract mates, raise nestlings. You can watch nestlings fledge. You can watch them get eaten by a hawk or a falcon. And you can do it all without having to go anywhere. You can do it from your porch. You can do it from your sidewalk. You probably do it from your window. I think of this now because I'm presenting from a bedroom in our house where during the beginning of the pandemic, I was laid up with what we think might have been COVID, wasn't sure. In any case, I had to isolate from the family. And so like from the view from the bed is of the neighboring house where house sparrows are nesting underneath the eaves. So I can just sort of sit there and like bird watch from bed, and a few weeks ago, I'd say this is probably end of February now, so a few months ago, I do some environmental education stuff with schools around Philadelphia, and I was visiting an after-school science club in a very urban South Philly neighborhood. When I say it's very urbanized and very well kept, which is actually works against you when you're trying to do programming around urban nature, because you don't have so many plants growing out of sidewalks. The bricks are all power washed, so you don't end up with a lot of lichens on them. And so what we did find that we could work with was what I like to call sparrow bush. And I don't think that's a technical term, but when I say it, most people seem to know what I'm talking about. It's like when in winter, sparrows flock up, right? And then you see them, or you hear them really first. Like you walk past a bush and you hear just like all these little chirps going off, and you look under the bush and there's some ton of bird poop underneath the bush. And every now and then, especially if it's sunny, like a few sparrows pop out, catch some sun and then pop back in. And so I had this group of kids, gave them notebooks and pencils. I asked a few questions, guys, which do you think are the males? Which do you think are the females? I had a conversation about sexual dimorphism, about species introduction, about urban ecology, just a block away from the school. And that's something that sparrows could offer to us. And so that's it. That's where I'm going to wind up the talk. I want to thank you guys again for having me on. I deleted a slide that had the blog address, but if there's blogging website called Substack these days, and I blog there. But yeah, we can shift to questions, and I'm happy to chat about sparrows, starlings, and pigeons.
If you have a question, please put it in the chat.
I had not thought of a burlesque song about eating urban pigeons, but I have heard of people doing it. There's a book that is interesting to read. I liked it, called what is it called? A Forager's Guide to Haute Cuisine, by a guy who's mostly known as a hunting personality named Stephen Ranella. And he basically, the book was him taking a old French cookbook, essentially, from like 100-something years ago, written by a cook to the French court, that kind of thing. And the guy had all these, what I would think was absurd recipes with weird animals you could only catch or buy if you were super rich. But these included pigeon. So he was like he sort of went under a bridge and got pigeon eggs to then raise so he would have squab. And then there's a recipe with sparrow breasts. So he had to catch a whole bunch of house sparrows and sort of bone them. so he could cook up sparrow breasts, which apparently was delicious, but also, one of those things that's so ridiculous to try to cook that it's only it'll only be for someone in a European court. What else got? So we had the relationship with pigeons and mourning doves. So I'm looking for the questions in the chat. We've got, I don't know what a Van Oort trap is. Allie, I don't know if you want to unmute and describe that to me, just so I know what we're talking about.
Does she know how to unmute?
Maybe not. Well, maybe we'll come back to that. But I have the traps I've heard of for most of these birds are basically a funnel trap, where you've got you can make a box out of hardware cloth or something like that, or some kind of steel mesh, and then you make a cone. They can walk into the conical entrance. It gets narrower as it goes in. And then once they're in the box, they can't figure out their way back out. And you put seed in there to trap them. But yeah, that's for people who are really working hard to keep them away from the bluebird boxes. That's what I see as the recommendation for starlings and sparrows.
There's a picture from Marion about something happening in Philly, pigeon for breakfast. So I
Is that a hawk?
Yeah, what is that?
It's a hawk and not a pigeon. Yeah.
Oh, all right.
Oh yeah, there's a video I saw once of people standing around an SUV that was a few blocks from where I worked. So this is right near Independence National Historical Park, maybe a couple blocks away from there. And it was just a pigeon going to town a red-tailed hawk going to town on a pigeon, plucking it, clipping its wings off, and it was a mess. So there's a question: why did the rock dove survive and not the carrier pigeon? I'd say carrier pigeons are rock doves. You're thinking of the passenger pigeon, for CK?
Yeah, I'm thinking of the homing doves or the doves the homing pigeons.
Well, no, the homing pigeons are basically rock doves that we use for almost like a sport, where where they'll fly back to their roost, and so you take them out, and then whoever's flock gets home first kind of wins.
So you're telling me if I go into the middle of the city and grab a few of these guys, then they'll come home or something? Or
exactly.
Is it the same bird?
Yeah, and this is why they're used to carry. They have been used to carry messages. So the logic of it is that you can take a pigeon with you from whatever point you'll need to get information back to, and then you release it with a little note attached to it somewhere, and it'll take it back to that home point. And so that's how homing pigeons work.
Okay, I understood that part. But I thought that they had gone extinct somehow. But obviously I'm confused. So.
Oh, it's okay. Well, the passenger pigeon went extinct, and that was a native North American bird that was. People talk about it occurring in the billions, and that is a sad environmental story. But basically, they were vast, just incredibly abundant, but this is in the era like the 1800s and the early 1900s of like rampant market hunting, and people would go out and just collect them from the roosts. They would shoot them out of the sky, and they were sort of done in by like a triple combination of deforestation, so
and
habitat destruction, and then the telegram and the railroad. Because what would happen is that you could get if you went out and shot a ton of passenger pigeons, you can get them into the nearest city pretty quickly. And then by telegram, people would send out word when they found a flock. And so that way the flocks, even as they dwindled, were targeted more and more efficiently. And that's what happened to our passenger pigeons. But
so the allure.
Go ahead.
the allure of killing them off was what?
It was
Kind
for
of like the
food.
buffalo or something?
No, this was purely market hunting for food. So that you
Food.
would ship them back to the nearest town. They'd sell them.
Oh,
And yeah, no, I didn't bring a reference to it along here, but there's from the mid 1800s, there was a kind of a study what they were going into food markets in Philadelphia, New York, and I think Baltimore, and cataloging everything you could buy. And it's basically a list of every native species of bird in like Eastern North America. You could go get robins, you could get woodpeckers, basically anything someone could shoot and could eat was then sold in a market in town.
so maybe because rock doves didn't flock, they didn't suffer the same fate.
No, but also their habitat is our habitat, and so they just were always there was no so there's no habitat pressure, and you're right, they don't flock up in the same concentrated way, so you can't wipe out every rock dove feral pigeon in an area like you could wipe out all the passenger pigeons. Yeah, and just on the homing pigeon point, I once actually the same playground I mentioned before is interesting. I found a pigeon carcass that had been picked clean, so probably a hawk got it or one of our falcons, I'm not sure. But it was picked clean by a predator, and it still had it had bands on it, numbered bands with like letters and numbers. And I looked it up, and I was able to figure out whose flock that pigeon came from because they're all kind of registered. The guy never wrote me back. I wrote him an email. It's like, I found your pigeon. Because I was so excited to be able to figure it out. But I guess he didn't really care that. I don't know. He'd gotten over it or just didn't feel like responding.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, this is Mary Bailey.
Mary.
I had the exact same experience. I found a band and figured out it was a band from someone who has racing pigeons. And I looked it up and found who it belonged to, sent them an email and a picture of the band and said, I found this bird deceased and thought you'd like to know. Never heard a thing.
Yeah, I don't know. I thought they'd be real. Maybe they get those emails every day.
Well, they're not pets,
Right.
I mean, a lost homing pigeon is even sometimes kind of hard to get. That's alive, can be kind of hard to get them to come retrieve because the attitude may be, well, it didn't find its way home, so I don't really want to have waste food on that one.
Yeah, what's the use of it at that point? I guess. Sorry. Now I looked at these Van Oort traps off that link. It's almost like a mouse trap you rig up to a bird box, like a nesting box. That is interesting. Thank you. And thank you for the recommendation about pigeons in World War II. Yeah, there's some famous stories about these pigeons carrying messages, getting sort of shot up, but still making it back to their home with the message.